Imagine a dentist, a man sworn to heal, not to kill, standing alone behind a Browning machine gun as nearly 100 enemy soldiers charge toward him through the darkness. Picture him firing until the barrel glows red, moving the gun 3 times under withering fire, fighting hand-to-hand when his ammunition runs out, and dying with his weapon still aimed at the enemy, 76 bullet wounds and bayonet strikes covering his body. This is not fiction. This is the true story of Captain Benjamin Salomon, a man who made the ultimate sacrifice on a blood-soaked Pacific island in 1944, and whose heroism was buried in bureaucracy for nearly 60 years before justice finally found him. The morning of July 8, 1944, broke hot and humid over Saipan, the air already thick with the stench of death that had accumulated over weeks of savage fighting. The island, a 15-mile-long volcanic outcrop in the Mariana Islands, had become a killing ground where 2 armies fought with a desperation that bordered on madness. For the Americans, Saipan represented a crucial stepping stone toward Japan itself, close enough for B-29 superfortresses to reach the enemy homeland. For the Japanese, losing Saipan meant losing the war, and they would die to the last man rather than accept defeat. The landscape bore witness to this apocalyptic struggle, pockmarked with shell craters, littered with abandoned equipment, and strewn with bodies that bloated and rotted under the merciless tropical sun. Palm trees stood as blackened skeletons, their fronds burned away by flamethrowers and artillery. The coral sand, which should have been white and pristine, was stained rust-brown with dried blood and churned into a muddy paste by thousands of boots and tank treads. Captain Benjamin Salomon had established his aid station in a salient near the village of Tanapag, a position dangerously exposed but necessary to provide immediate care for the wounded men of the 105th Infantry Regiment, 27th Infantry Division. The aid station itself was nothing more than a large tent with a few supporting poles, canvas sides that provided no real protection, and several makeshift operating tables constructed from ammunition crates and salvaged wood. Medical supplies were stacked in metal containers along one side, morphine syrettes, bandages, sulfa powder, surgical instruments still bloody from the previous night's work. The ground beneath the tent was covered with a layer of coral sand mixed with dirt, which turned to a slippery paste when blood soaked into it, making every step treacherous. Outside, wounded men lay on stretchers or sat propped against supply crates, waiting their turn for treatment, their faces gray with shock and pain. Some moaned softly, others remained silent, staring at nothing with eyes that had seen too much. The smell of antiseptic and ether mixed with the overwhelming odor of blood, sweat, and the sweet sick smell of gangrene that clung to the worst wounds. Benjamin Salomon was 30 years old, though the past weeks of continuous combat had aged him beyond his years. Before the war, he had been a successful dentist in Los Angeles, having graduated from the University of Southern California School of Dentistry in 1937. His practice on West 3rd Street had been modest but thriving, filled with grateful patients who appreciated his gentle touch and genuine concern for their well-being. He was a soft-spoken man with a quick smile, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and asked about your children while preparing to drill a cavity. But there was another side to Benjamin Salomon, a side his patients never saw. Every weekend, he drove to a shooting range in the hills outside Los Angeles, where he practiced with rifles and pistols until his shooting was nothing short of extraordinary. He had grown up hunting in the Wisconsin woods with his father, and marksmanship had become not just a skill but a meditation, a way to clear his mind and find focus. His friends at the range joked that he could shoot the wings off a fly at 100 yards, and it wasn't much of an exaggeration. When war came and Salomon enlisted, he had initially been assigned as an infantry officer because of his shooting scores and natural leadership abilities, but his dental training made him too valuable as a medical officer, so the Army transferred him to the Medical Corps with the rank of captain. The contradiction gnawed at him sometimes during quiet moments. He had taken an oath to do no harm, to heal and preserve life. The Geneva Convention was explicit. Medical personnel were non-combatants, protected by international law, wearing the Red Cross as a symbol of their sacred duty to treat all wounded regardless of which uniform they wore. Yet here he was, trained as a killer, his muscle memory honed by thousands of hours at the range, his mind capable of calculating windage and elevation instinctively, all of that lethal knowledge sitting dormant while he sutured wounds and administered morphine. He carried no weapon except a holstered pistol that he had never fired in combat, relying instead on the dubious protection of the Geneva Convention and the hope that enemy soldiers would respect the Red Cross on his helmet. Most days, he pushed these thoughts aside and focused on his work, saving as many men as he could, pulling shrapnel from torn flesh, clamping arteries that spurted blood with each heartbeat, whispering words of comfort to boys who cried for their mothers as they died. That was his war, fought with scalpels and sutures rather than bullets and bayonets. But July 7th had shattered whatever illusions anyone might have held about the nature of this war. As darkness fell that evening, intelligence reports indicated unusual Japanese activity in the American sector. Radio intercepts suggested something big was coming, though exactly what remained unclear. The 27th Infantry Division, positioned in the center of the American line, prepared for an attack, but nothing could have prepared them for what was about to happen. Around 3 in the morning on July 8th, the Japanese launched the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, many armed only with bamboo spears or sharpened sticks, some carrying explosives strapped to their bodies, came screaming out of the darkness in a human wave that defied all rational military logic. They had been told that death in battle was the highest honor, that surrender was unthinkable shame, and that taking as many Americans with them as possible was their sacred duty to the emperor. They came drunk on sake, bellowing Banzai, until their throats went raw, running directly into machine gun fire without hesitation, trampling their own dead to reach the American lines. The sound was like nothing Salomon had ever experienced, a wall of noise that seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on the chest and making it hard to breathe. The rattle of machine guns firing in long, continuous bursts blended with the crump of mortar rounds, the bang of rifle grenades, and the screams of thousands of charging men. The night sky lit up with muzzle flashes and explosions, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed across the battlefield. Tracer rounds arced through the darkness like deadly fireflies, every fifth round glowing red as it searched for flesh. The Americans fired until their barrels overheated and had to be changed, until ammunition belts ran out and frantic supply parties sprinted forward with more, until the bodies piled so high in front of the defensive positions that they formed barriers that the next wave had to climb over. And still they came, wave after wave, climbing over their own dead, many of them already wounded but refusing to fall, driven by a fanaticism that defied comprehension. The American line buckled and broke in several places. Japanese soldiers poured through the gaps, overrunning command posts and artillery positions, killing anyone they found. Some Americans fought to the last bullet and then fixed bayonets for the final stand. Others retreated in confusion, falling back through the darkness, while their officers tried desperately to establish new defensive lines. The 105th Infantry Regiment, where Salomon served, took the brunt of the assault on the left flank. By dawn, the situation had become critical. Japanese forces had penetrated deep into the American rear area, and Salomon's aid station suddenly found itself on the front line, a canvas tent offering no protection against the enemy soldiers who were now fighting hand-to-hand with American troops less than 50 yards away. Salomon had been operating continuously since the attack began, working by the light of hissing Coleman lanterns that cast long shadows across the tent. His surgical smock was soaked with blood, his hands cramping from hours of delicate work performed under impossible conditions. A young private lay on the table before him, his abdomen open to reveal intestines torn by shrapnel, loops of bowel that had to be carefully inspected for perforations, each one requiring meticulous suturing. The boy was unconscious from ether, his breathing shallow and rapid. His chances of survival perhaps 50-50 if Salomon could finish the surgery and get him evacuated before infection set in. 2 corpsmen assisted, holding retractors and sponging away blood so Salomon could see what he was doing. Another dozen wounded men waited outside, their conditions ranging from minor to critical, each one needing attention that Salomon couldn't provide fast enough. He had already sent 10 men to the graves registration unit, boys who had died before he could save them, their bodies laid out in a neat row behind the tent with ponchos covering their faces. He tried not to think about them, tried to focus only on the living, on the next stitch and the next clamp, but their faces haunted him nonetheless. The sound of fighting grew closer as he worked. Small arms fire crackled nearby, punctuated by the hollow thump of grenades. He heard shouting in English and Japanese, the unmistakable sounds of men killing each other at close range. Still he continued the surgery, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins, because the boy on the table deserved every chance to live, and abandoning him now would mean certain death. One of the corpsmen glanced nervously toward the tent entrance, then back at Salomon, waiting for orders. The captain shook his head slightly. Keep working. Not yet, we're not finished. He ligated one more bleeder, placed one more suture, his mind calculating how much longer he needed, weighing the boy's life against the approaching danger. Then chaos erupted. Japanese soldiers burst through the American perimeter like a flood breaking through a dam. They came through gaps in the line, exploiting every weakness, moving with the desperate speed of men who knew they were already dead. For enemy soldiers appeared at the entrance to the aid station, their uniforms torn and filthy, their faces twisted with battle rage. They had no interest in the Geneva Convention or the sanctity of medical facilities. They saw Americans and attacked. The first soldier swung his rifle like a club, catching one of Salomon's corpsmen across the skull with a sickening crack. The man dropped instantly, his body going limp, blood pouring from his shattered head. The second corpsman raised his hands in surrender or perhaps to show he was unarmed, and a Japanese soldier bayoneted him through the stomach, the blade punching through his body and emerging from his back. The soldier twisted the rifle to free the blade, and the corpsman fell backward, clutching the wound as his life pumped out between his fingers. Something snapped inside Benjamin Salomon in that moment. Later, those who tried to understand his actions would point to this instant as the turning point, when the dentist who had sworn to heal became something else entirely, something primal and deadly. He didn't think, didn't weigh his options or consider the consequences. His body simply moved, driven by instincts honed through 10,000 hours at the shooting range. His hand dropped to the holstered pistol at his side, drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The first shot caught a Japanese soldier in the chest, punching through his sternum and into his heart. The man staggered backward, a look of surprise on his face, and crumpled. Salomon pivoted, acquired the next target, fired. The second soldier spun away, hit in the shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. The third and fourth soldiers hesitated just for a fraction of a second, and that hesitation killed them. Salomon fired twice more, both shots hitting center mass, both men falling. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 5 seconds from start to finish. For enemy soldiers dead or dying, Salomon standing in the center of his aid station with his pistol still extended, his ears ringing from the shots in the enclosed space, cordite smoke drifting around him like fog. He looked down at the private on the operating table, still unconscious, still breathing. The boy was alive, but barely, and there was no time to finish the surgery properly. Salomon grabbed a handful of sulfa powder and dumped it into the abdominal cavity, then began closing the incision as quickly as he could, his stitches rough but functional. He had to get the wounded men out of the tent, had to get them to safety before more Japanese soldiers arrived. He barked orders at the remaining able-bodied soldiers nearby. Get these men on stretchers, move them back, get them out of here now. Men scrambled to obey, lifting wounded soldiers and carrying them away from the aid station toward the rear, some walking, some being dragged, all of them desperate to escape the collapsing perimeter. But even as the evacuation began, Salomon realized the terrible truth. The Japanese were everywhere now, flooding through the American lines in numbers that made retreat impossible for everyone. Wounded men who couldn't walk would never make it. The enemy would catch them, kill them, bayonet them as they lay helpless on their stretchers. Someone had to hold the Japanese back, had to buy time for the evacuation. Someone had to make a stand. And looking around at the frightened, exhausted soldiers near his aid station, soldiers who had been fighting all night and were nearly out of ammunition, Salomon understood that he was the only one who could do it. Not because he was braver than the others, not because he wanted to die, but because his particular set of skills, his marksmanship, his calmness under pressure, his ability to make impossible shots under combat conditions, made him the only logical choice. It was a simple equation, really a cold calculation. One man with extraordinary shooting ability could kill more enemy soldiers and buy more time than 3 or 4 average riflemen. And if that man was a medical officer who wasn't supposed to be fighting anyway, whose death would be a violation of the Geneva Convention but whose life was already forfeit the moment he picked up a weapon, then the equation became even simpler. He had crossed the line. He couldn't go back. The only thing left was to make his death count for something. About 30 yards from the aid station stood a Browning M1917A1 heavy machine gun, sitting on its tripod with several boxes of ammunition stacked nearby. The gun position had been hastily abandoned during the Japanese breakthrough, its crew either dead or retreating. The weapon itself was a beast, a water-cooled, belt-fed machine gun that weighed over 100 pounds when fully assembled, capable of firing .30-06 rounds at a rate of 450 to 600 rounds per minute. It was designed to be operated by a crew of at least 3 men, 1 to fire, 1 to feed ammunition belts, and 1 to change barrels and refill the water jacket when it overheated. Operating it alone was technically possible but exhausting and dangerous, requiring the shooter to not only aim and fire but also manage the ammunition feed, clear jams, and adjust for overheating, all while under fire. Salomon had trained on the Browning during his brief time as an infantry officer, but that had been years ago, and he had never fired one in combat. Still, the basics came back to him as he approached the weapon. Check the belt, ensure it's feeding properly. Test the traversing and elevating mechanism. Make sure the water jacket is full. The gun appeared to be in working order, though the ground around it was littered with spent brass casings and empty ammunition boxes, evidence of the desperate fighting that had taken place here just minutes earlier. He settled in behind the weapon, his hands finding their positions automatically, left hand on the spade grip to guide the weapon's aim, right hand on the thumb trigger. He pressed his shoulder against the stock, sighting down the barrel toward the area where Japanese soldiers were now advancing in groups, some moving cautiously, others running forward in short rushes from cover to cover. They didn't know yet that this particular gun position had come back to life, didn't know that death was looking at them through the weapon's sights. Salomon waited, controlling his breathing, letting them come closer, choosing his moment. At 200 yards, he pressed the trigger. The Browning roared to life with a sound like ripping canvas amplified 1,000 times. A sustained burst that sent 20 rounds downrange in less than 3 seconds. The heavy .30-06 bullets smashed into the advancing Japanese with devastating effect. Men falling in windrows, some killed instantly, others wounded and screaming. The momentum of the charge broken in an instant. Salomon traversed the gun left, fired another burst, then right, sweeping the weapon across his field of fire like a scythe cutting wheat. Bodies fell and kept falling. The noise was incredible, a physical assault on the senses. Each round that left the barrel created a muzzle blast that punched the air, and the cumulative effect of firing dozens of rounds in quick succession was like standing next to a jackhammer that never stopped. The brass casings ejected from the side of the weapon in a glittering stream, pinging off the metal ammunition box and landing in a growing pile at Salomon's feet. The acrid smell of burned powder filled his nostrils, mixing with the coppery scent of blood and the earthy smell of churned soil. Heat waves shimmered above the barrel as it began to glow dull red from the friction of so many bullets passing through it at high velocity. The water in the cooling jacket started to steam, hissing and bubbling, a thin stream of vapor rising from the relief valve. Salomon's hands and arms absorbed the violent shaking of the weapon, his muscles tensing to keep it under control, to keep the rounds on target, despite the incredible recoil forces trying to throw his aim off. The Japanese reacted quickly once they realized where the fire was coming from. Rifles cracked and bullets snapped past Salomon's head with the distinctive sound of supersonic projectiles, a sharp crack that made his hindbrain scream at him to take cover. But there was no cover here, just the machine gun and its tripod, and if he ducked away the weapon would fall silent and the Japanese would surge forward and kill everyone in the aid station. So he stayed put, kept firing, accepting that every second he remained at the gun increased the chance that a bullet would find him. He could hear rounds impacting the ground around him, throwing up little fountains of dirt and coral. One bullet struck the ammunition box to his right with a metallic clang. Another hit the tripod leg, leaving a bright scar in the metal. It was only a matter of time before one found flesh. A group of Japanese soldiers tried to flank the position, moving through a depression in the ground that offered some cover from the direct fire. Salomon caught the movement in his peripheral vision, swung the gun hard to the left, and fired a long burst into the depression without being able to see his targets clearly. He walked the fire back and forth across the area, adjusting by observing where his tracers impacted, compensating for the range and trajectory. The flanking movement stopped. Whether he had killed them all or just forced them to go to ground, he didn't know and didn't have time to care. The immediate threat was neutralized, and that was enough. He swung the gun back to the front, engaging targets that were now trying to use dead bodies as cover, firing over or around their fallen comrades. Salomon aimed carefully despite the circumstances, putting short bursts into concentrations of enemy soldiers, conserving ammunition where he could because he didn't know how much was left and there would be no resupply. His mind raced through calculations even as his hands worked the weapon automatically. The boxes of ammunition stacked nearby held 250-round belts, and he had started with perhaps 6 or 7 boxes, maybe 1,500 rounds total. He had already fired several hundred rounds in the initial engagement, which meant he had perhaps 1,000 rounds left, maybe less. At his current rate of fire, selecting targets carefully and firing in controlled bursts rather than simply hosing down the area, he could sustain this for perhaps 10 more minutes before the ammunition ran out. 10 minutes to buy time for the evacuation. 10 minutes to kill as many enemy soldiers as possible. 10 minutes left to live. The Japanese, frustrated by their inability to advance against the withering fire, began to coordinate their assault more carefully. They had identified Salomon's position now, and they focused their attention on eliminating the single gun that was holding up their entire advance in this sector. Rifle grenades began to fall around the position, crude projectiles launched from special cups attached to rifle muzzles. They exploded with sharp cracks, throwing shrapnel in all directions. One landed close enough that Salomon felt the blast wave wash over him, felt fragments tugging at his uniform without penetrating. Another exploded 10 feet to his left, and something struck his leg, a searing pain that made him grunt but didn't stop him from firing. He glanced down and saw blood soaking through his trousers, a piece of shrapnel embedded in his thigh muscle. The wound burned like fire, but the leg still worked, still supported his weight, and he ignored it because acknowledging pain was a luxury he couldn't afford. There would be time to assess his injuries later, if later ever came. The barrel was glowing bright red now, the heat so intense that it was visible even in the daylight. The water in the cooling jacket had reached boiling point, steam pouring from the relief valve in a continuous jet. If the water boiled away entirely, the barrel would warp from the heat and the weapon would cease functioning. Salomon needed to let it cool, but cooling meant stopping firing, and stopping meant the Japanese would advance. It was an impossible choice, and he made the only decision he could. He kept firing, accepting that he was probably destroying the weapon, gambling that it would last long enough to matter. The gun continued to function, round after round feeding through the mechanism and blasting downrange, the action cycling with mechanical precision despite the abuse. The Browning M1917A1 was an old design, based on John Browning's genius from World War I, but it was overbuilt and reliable, capable of withstanding punishment that would destroy lesser weapons. If there was any gun that could hold up under these conditions, this was it. Enemy return fire intensified. The volume of bullets snapping past Salomon's position increased to the point where the air itself seemed to hiss with their passage. He heard screams from behind him, from the area where wounded men were still being evacuated, and realized with sick certainty that some of the enemy fire was getting through, hitting men who couldn't defend themselves. The knowledge added urgency to his work. He fired faster, accepting decreased accuracy in exchange for greater volume of fire, trying to suppress the enemy positions long enough for the evacuation to be completed. His arms ached from controlling the vibrating weapon, his hands cramping on the grips, his ears ringing so badly that he could barely hear anything except a high-pitched whine. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, mixing with the powder residue that coated his skin. He blinked it away and kept firing. A bullet struck his left arm, punching through the muscle just below his shoulder. The impact spun him partially around, and for a moment his grip on the weapon loosened. The gun's muzzle dipped toward the ground, and the belt feed jammed as the angle changed. Salomon bit back a scream, forced his left arm back into position despite the white-hot pain, and cleared the jam with practiced motions that his hands remembered even when his brain was screaming. He got the gun firing again, but his left arm was weakening now, blood running down to his elbow and dripping onto the weapon. Another hit, this one to his right side, a bullet that felt like being punched by a heavyweight boxer, driving the air from his lungs and making him gasp. He looked down and saw blood spreading across his shirt, a dark stain that grew larger with each heartbeat. The bullet had entered below his ribs, and he had no way to know how much damage it had done internally. Could be a through and through that missed everything vital, could be fatal, no way to tell. He kept firing. The ammunition belt feeding into the gun ran out, the last round firing and leaving the weapon silent. Salomon grabbed the next belt from the ammunition box, his bloody hands making the task more difficult, fumbling with the metal links as precious seconds ticked away. The Japanese, seeing the gun fall silent, began to advance again, rushing forward in small groups while others provided covering fire. Salomon got the new belt loaded, charged the weapon, and resumed firing just as the nearest enemy soldiers closed to within 50 yards. He fired directly into them at point-blank range, the heavy bullets doing catastrophic damage to human bodies at such close proximity, literally tearing men apart. The advance faltered again, broke, enemy soldiers diving for cover or simply falling where they stood. But they kept trying, kept coming, driven by orders or fanaticism or the simple knowledge that retreat was not an option. Salomon knew his position had become untenable. The Japanese had his range now, and they were concentrating fire on his location with everything they had. Staying here meant death in the next few minutes, perhaps seconds. But he also knew that moving the gun would be almost impossible. The Browning and its tripod weighed over 100 pounds, and he was already wounded in 3 places, his strength fading as blood loss took its toll. A healthy, uninjured man would struggle to move this weapon alone under fire. For Salomon, wounded and exhausted, it should have been impossible. But the evacuation was still ongoing. He could hear vehicles starting up behind him, could hear the shouts of men coordinating the movement of wounded soldiers. They needed more time, just a few more minutes. He made his decision. He collapsed the tripod legs slightly to make the weapon lower and more stable, then grabbed the carrying handles on either side of the receiver. He lifted with his legs, feeling something tear in his wounded side, feeling fresh blood flow hot down his body. The weapon came off the ground, incredibly heavy, every ounce of its mass seeming to multiply as he tried to carry it. He staggered sideways, moving toward a slight rise in the ground about 20 yards to his right, a position that would offer a marginally better field of fire and might confuse the Japanese for a few moments as they adjusted their aim. Each step was agony, his wounded leg threatening to collapse under the combined weight of his body and the gun, his arms screaming in protest, his breathing ragged and shallow. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, one passing so close to his head that he felt the heat of its passage. He covered the 20 yards in what felt like an hour but was probably less than 30 seconds, dropped the gun into position at the new location, and resumed firing without bothering to properly set up the tripod. From this angle, he could see Japanese soldiers trying to work their way around his original position, clearly planning to attack from the flank where they thought he still was. He engaged them before they realized their mistake, firing into their exposed flank and cutting them down in a matter of seconds. The surprise was total, and the casualties were devastating. Bodies piled up in grotesque heaps, the dead falling on top of the wounded, some men still moving weakly underneath the corpses, unable to free themselves. The scene was beyond anything Salomon had ever imagined in his darkest nightmares. A vision of hell made real, and he was the architect of it. He felt nothing, no horror, no regret, no satisfaction. There was only the mechanical process of killing, selecting targets and pressing the trigger, a task he performed with the same focused intensity he had once brought to drilling teeth. This was simply another form of surgery, removing threats instead of removing cavities. The principle was the same even if the outcome was infinitely more final. His vision began to narrow, dark spots appearing at the edges of his peripheral vision. Blood loss was catching up with him, his body struggling to maintain blood pressure as his cardiovascular system tried to compensate for the volume he had lost. He shook his head violently, trying to clear it, and for a moment the darkness receded. He kept firing. The Japanese were closer now, some of them less than 30 yards away, and their fire was more accurate at this range. Something struck his helmet with a tremendous clang, spinning it off his head and leaving his ears ringing even worse than before. The bullet had struck a glancing blow, creasing the steel and probably giving him a concussion, but not penetrating. An inch different and it would have killed him instantly. He didn't bother retrieving the helmet, just kept firing with his head exposed. Another ammunition belt ran dry. He reached for the next box and found it was the last one. 250 rounds left, maybe 3 minutes of sustained fire if he was careful. He loaded the belt, his hands moving sluggishly now, his fine motor control deteriorating as shock set in. The weapon resumed its deadly work, but Salomon knew the end was close. He had killed dozens of enemy soldiers, maybe more than 100, it was impossible to count in the chaos. He had bought time for the evacuation, had held this position against overwhelming odds for what must have been 15 or 20 minutes, though time had become elastic and untrustworthy. He had done his duty, had saved as many of his wounded men as he could. Whether it was enough would be for others to judge. The Japanese, perhaps sensing that the gun was finally running low on ammunition or perhaps simply willing to accept any casualties necessary to eliminate this threat, launched a final coordinated assault. They came from 3 directions simultaneously, dozens of soldiers rising from cover and rushing forward with fixed bayonets, screaming as they charged. Salomon engaged the closest group, fired a long burst that dropped several men, traversed to the second group, fired again. The third group was going to reach him before he could traverse that far. He kept firing into the second group, killing as many as he could before they got close enough to matter, then swung the gun toward the third group just as his ammunition ran out. The belt fed through its last round and the gun went silent, the barrel glowing white-hot, steam pouring from the water jacket, the mechanism too hot to touch. He had perhaps 3 seconds before the enemy soldiers reached him. Benjamin Salomon released the grips of the Browning and drew his pistol. The weapon felt impossibly light after handling the machine gun, and his hand was shaking badly, the sights wavering as he tried to aim. The first Japanese soldier was less than 10 feet away, bayonet extended, mouth open in a war cry. Salomon fired, missed, fired again and hit the man in the throat. The soldier went down thrashing, blood spraying. The second soldier was right behind the first. Salomon fired twice more, both shots hitting center mass, and the man collapsed. A third soldier was on him before he could fire again, the bayonet thrusting toward his chest. Salomon twisted aside, the blade sliding past his ribs and tearing a gash in his side. He brought the pistol up under the soldier's chin and fired, the man's head snapping back, his body going limp and falling. More soldiers were closing in. Salomon fired again, the slide locked back on an empty magazine. He had no more ammunition, nothing left but his hands and his will to resist. A bayonet punched into his stomach, driven by a soldier who had come from his blind side. Salomon grunted, grabbed the rifle barrel with both hands, and twisted, trying to wrench it away from his attacker. The soldier held on, and they grappled for a moment that seemed frozen in time. 2 men locked together in a struggle that could only end one way. Another soldier approached from behind and drove his bayonet into Salomon's back, the blade grating against his spine. Salomon's legs buckled, but he didn't fall. He released the rifle he had been trying to take and threw a wild punch that connected with someone's face, felt bone crunch under his knuckles. Hands grabbed him from multiple directions, pulling him down. He fought them, thrashing and striking out blindly, refusing to die quietly. A rifle but struck his head, and white light exploded behind his eyes. More blows rained down, bayonets thrust and withdrawn, thrust again. He felt each one as a distant pressure, his nervous system shutting down, his body's pain receptors overloaded and failing. He fell to his knees beside the machine gun, his hands automatically reaching for the grips one last time, a reflex action that had no purpose now. Blood poured from dozens of wounds, pooling beneath him, soaking into the coral sand. He slumped forward onto the weapon, his body draping over it in what would become his final position. The Japanese soldiers continued to stab him, making absolutely certain he was dead, giving him no chance to feign death and shoot them later. They had learned to respect this one American, this one man who had held them up for so long, and they were taking no chances. 76 wounds they would inflict in total, bullet wounds and bayonet thrusts covering his body from head to legs. When they finally moved on, convinced beyond any doubt that he was dead, his body remained draped over the machine gun, his hands still on the grips, his weapon still aimed at the enemy even in death. Behind him, the evacuation had succeeded. Wounded men who would have died had been carried to safety, loaded into trucks and jeeps, transported back to secure areas where they could receive proper medical treatment. Some would survive because of the time Captain Salomon had bought them. Not all wounds and infections would still claim many, but some would live who would otherwise have died. They would go home to wives and girlfriends, would have children and grandchildren, would live long lives made possible by those 20 minutes when one man held off an army. Most of them would never know his name, would never learn who had saved them. The fog of war obscured so much, and in the chaos of the Japanese breakthrough and the desperate fighting that followed, individual acts of heroism were lost in the larger narrative of the battle. But some would remember, some would know that a dentist with a machine gun had given them their futures. The battle for Saipan continued for several more days, but the Japanese Banzai charge had been their last gasp, a death spasm that accomplished nothing except to add more bodies to the count. American forces methodically cleared the remaining pockets of resistance, and on July 9th, the island was declared secure. The cost had been staggering. Nearly 3,500 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines killed, more than 13,000 wounded. The Japanese losses were even worse, virtually their entire garrison of 30,000 troops killed, along with thousands of civilians who had been caught in the fighting or who had committed suicide rather than surrender. It was a Pyrrhic victory in many ways, the cost almost too high to bear, but strategically crucial. B-29 bombers would soon be flying from Saipan to strike Tokyo, and the road to Japan's doorstep was now open. Captain Benjamin Salomon's body was found where he had fallen, still draped over the machine gun in a position that told its own story. The examining officers counted 76 bullet and bayonet wounds, most of them inflicted after death, evidence of how desperately the Japanese had wanted to silence that gun.